Pack your bags and never come back." My son yelled after my wife's funeral. The words slammed into me harder than the winter wind cutting through the driveway. My chest tightened, my hands trembled slightly, yet I stood still. My hair, gray but beautifully styled, caught the faint morning light. My clean-shaven face showed no rage, only the weight of 70 years and a lifetime of love now shattered. My slightly healthy build was tense, every muscle aware of the shock I had just received. I had just said goodbye to my wife, the woman who had shared my life for decades, my constant companion through joy, sorrow, and ordinary days alike. And now my own son, the boy I had nurtured and guided, turned his grief into a weapon aimed directly at me. He pointed a shaking finger in my direction. "I don't want to see you here ever again. You don't belong in this house, Dad." I did not respond. I did not shout. I did not fight. I simply stood there, letting the words wash over me like the bitter wind. My warm eyes met his, calm but filled with sorrow, trying to reach the part of him still capable of understanding, still capable of love. The driveway light flickered above him, casting jagged shadows that danced over his face, highlighting the anger, the pain, the loss he had turned inward and now projected outward. My gaze drifted past him to the small garden where my wife had planted tulips every spring. I remembered her laughing as he tripped over a sprinkler head, how she had scolded him gently, and how he had thrown his head back and laughed uncontrollably. Those moments felt like echoes from another life, another world where love was still tangible. I shifted my weight, feeling the cold stone beneath my feet. Every corner of the house screamed memories, photos on the walls, dishes in the sink, the smell of my wife's perfume lingering faintly on the curtains. And yet, the man who had once called me Dad had no patience, no tenderness left to offer. He stormed inside, slamming the door so violently that the windows rattled in their frames. The sound pierced the silence of the neighborhood, drawing the eyes of passing neighbors, though none knew the full story of grief, betrayal, and anger that had just erupted here. I remained on the steps, breathing slowly, letting the weight of my loss and the sting of rejection settle over me like a heavy blanket. I stepped back onto the sidewalk, gripping the strap of the small bag I had packed with essentials, the only worldly possessions I would carry today. The corner bench down the street, cold and unwelcoming, seemed to call me. I walked there, feeling the pavement rough against my shoes, the chill biting through my coat. I sat, letting my fingers trace the edges of the metal armrest. The coldness was grounding, a tangible connection to the real world amidst the storm of my thoughts. Around me, the city continued. Cars passed quietly, the hum of tires against asphalt blending with distant voices, doors closing and early birds chirping. The world was moving on, oblivious to the fracture in my own. The park lamp flickered above me, casting dim light across the frozen bench. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, letting memories of her warmth, her laughter, her touch fill the void. I remembered our wedding day, her hand in mine, the gentle sway of her gown, her eyes sparkling with life. I remembered raising our son, teaching him to ride a bike, to speak honestly, to be kind, to love. And now that same son had become a stranger, a reflection of all the pain and anger we had never taught him to channel properly. I thought of the years, of the sacrifices, of the nights spent awake at her hospital bedside, holding her hand, whispering that she would be okay, whispering that I loved her endlessly. And now, even in death, my grief had become a battleground where my own child sought to punish me for circumstances beyond anyone's control. The wind picked up again, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree, scattering them across the street. The mist settled over the pavement, making the world feel softer, dreamlike, almost surreal. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, letting the chill sharpen my senses. My eyes swept over the street, noting every flicker of light, every shadow, every sign that life was moving on. And in that quiet observation, a strange clarity began to emerge. I realized that anger, no matter how loud, no matter how bitter, could not erase love. It could not undo decades of life, of memories, of bonds. And yet, actions have consequences, often delayed, often hidden, but inevitable. My son would soon learn that the world does not bend to fury, that disrespect carries a price, and that those who attempt to cast away others may find themselves abandoned in turn. I exhaled slowly, letting the mist of my breath mingle with the morning fog. My fingers tightened around the strap of my bag. The city hummed quietly around me, unaware that the man who had demanded I leave would soon face a reality he could never have imagined. The bench was hard, the wind biting, but for the first time since the funeral, a sense of purpose settled within me. I would endure. I would remain calm. I would not seek revenge with anger, but I would let the consequences unfold. And by the next morning, the son who had hurled me into the street with words alone would face the reality of his own hubris. I opened my eyes, scanning the empty road, letting the rising sun paint the houses and the distant trees gold. I could almost see the future twisting into shape. His arrogance, his disrespect, his cruelty, they were all about to collide with the one force he had never considered: inevitability. And I waited, quietly, patiently, calmly, because justice, when wielded without hate, is always the most devastating. The night passed quietly, almost deceptively so. I stayed on that cold bench until the first light of dawn, my hands gripping the small bag, my mind replaying every cruel word my son had spat at me. He had shouted like a man possessed, demanding my absence from the home we had shared for decades. And yet I remained calm, my clean-shaven face and neatly styled gray hair a mask of quiet endurance dot by morning. The streets were beginning to wake. Neighbors walked their dogs, joggers ran past, and the hum of the city slowly filled the air. My son, I imagined, had woken in the house, likely feeling triumphant, believing he had cast me away, believing he had proven his control. I wondered if he felt any guilt or if his pride had already swallowed it whole. I walked toward the house slowly, keeping to the shadows. I had made one small call the night before a lawyer I trusted, one who understood both the law and the subtleties of human pride. A few signatures, some paperwork, and the house legally was in my name. My son had thrown me out in anger, but the law, patient and indifferent, had already sided with the one who had truly loved, cared, and worked for the home. When he opened the front door, I was nowhere to be seen. The house, so full of memories of my wife, smelled faintly of perfume lingering in the air, mingling with the bitter morning cold. My son's face twisted from triumph to confusion. The locks he had relied on for dominance no longer worked. He jiggled the doorknob again and again, panic creeping into his sharp features. "Dad?" he called, his voice cracking slightly. He had expected to find me trembling, perhaps pleading, perhaps terrified. Instead, there was silence. The house, once a place of comfort for him, now felt like a cage. Every room reminded him of the person he had tried to cast away, of the calm strength he had underestimated. I watched from a distance, my clean-shaven face serene, my hair catching the pale sunlight. I did not need to shout. I did not need to throw his arrogance back in his face. The law, the inevitability of consequence, was working in silence. And there he was standing at the threshold of the home he had called his own, realizing for the first time that entitlement and anger cannot hold a man in power. Around him, life continued. The neighbors paused as they saw him knocking frantically, shouting for a key that would not work, for a house that legally no longer belonged to him. Some smiled knowingly, perhaps remembering the chaos, the arguments, the fights over money, over respect, over pride. Some shook their heads, sensing the poetic justice unfolding before them. My son's voice, Once sharp and commanding, now faltered. He tried the door again, then peered through the windows. Every glance reflected the confusion, the fear, and the helplessness that anger often brings when it meets consequences. He had demanded I leave, but life had already turned the tables. I felt no joy in his suffering, only the quiet, calm satisfaction of inevitability. Years of patience, of raising him, of keeping love in the home, had prepared me for this moment. Not for cruelty, but for justice delivered without malice. I lingered, watching him pacing the porch, realizing that the house, every wall, every room, every memory was no longer under his command. The power he thought he wielded had evaporated, replaced by a growing understanding that actions, even shouted in anger, carry weight. And as he sank slowly to the ground on the cold porch steps, the realization began to break him. The man who had demanded my absence, the boy who had shouted after my wife's funeral, was learning what patience, wisdom, and rightful authority truly meant. By the time I finally stepped closer, the early sun casting long shadows over the quiet street, I could see the trembling of his hands, the curve of his shoulders folding under guilt, and the first seeds of understanding growing painfully in his chest. I did not speak. I did not rush to gloat. Silence, I knew, was the sharpest teacher. And in that silence, he was learning more than I ever could have shouted at him. I did not speak. I did not rush to gloat. Silence, I knew, was the sharpest teacher. And in that silence, he was learning more than I ever could have shouted at him. The bench, the cold wind, the mist lifting slowly from the pavement, I watched all of it, calm and measured, knowing that this day would change him forever. And the son who had cast me away in anger would never forget the quiet power of consequence. By midday, the street outside the house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I watched from a safe distance as my son continued to wrestle with the reality he had created for himself. His anger had vanished, replaced by panic and confusion. The doors remained locked, the keys in his hand useless. Every room he had claimed as his own reminded him that entitlement alone could not secure the life he thought he controlled. I remembered the mornings when I had walked him to school, teaching him to tie his shoes, to greet his teachers politely, to treat others with respect. I had thought those lessons would carry him far, give him wisdom. And yet here he was, crumpled on the cold porch, unable to see past his own pride. The sun climbed higher, bathing the quiet neighborhood in stark light. Shadows shifted across the driveway where I had once parked my old car. I could see the slight tremor in his hands as he finally sank to the concrete steps. Each movement told a story of growing realization. Each breath a mixture of fear and shame. I took a careful step forward, my clean-shaven face calm, my hair catching the light, my slightly healthy build poised and unshakable. I did not need to approach him closely, he could feel my presence. The quiet authority I carried simply by existing, simply by surviving the storm of grief, anger, and loss that had hit us all. Neighbors peered cautiously from behind curtains, whispers floating in the air like dust motes. Some exchanged knowing glances, sensing the poetic justice unfolding on that quiet suburban street. My son had demanded I leave, yet here he was, stripped of comfort, facing the bitter taste of his own actions. I thought of my wife and the small apartment we had first moved into together. We had scraped, saved, and built a life not of wealth. Every choice I had made was meant to guide him, to prepare him for adulthood, for the world outside. And yet, pride and arrogance had blinded him. Now the universe was correcting the imbalance, silently, inexorably. I could see his chest rise and fall faster as the morning wore on. He glanced toward the windows he had once called his own, shaking his head, trying to understand why the locks had changed, why his demands had failed. The realization was spreading like frost, slow, icy, unavoidable. I had watched families fight before, but this was different. This was the child I had nurtured, raised, loved unconditionally, now staring directly into the consequences of his anger. Every shout he had thrown at me after my wife's funeral, every cruel command, every threat to cast me away, was now reflected back in the cold, silent authority of law and patience. I shifted slightly, my hair catching the sunlight again, feeling the weight of both years and quiet determination. I wanted him to understand something deeper than fear. I wanted him to realize that respect cannot be demanded, that love cannot be broken by a few angry words, and that life has a way of teaching the lessons arrogance refuses to hear. Hours passed slowly. I watched him pacing, attempting to force open doors, checking windows, the shadow of panic stretching longer across the porch. His face, once brimming with certainty and pride, was now a mask of confusion, guilt, and helplessness. Then, finally, he collapsed on the porch again, the harsh concrete digging into his palms. His chest heaved, and for a moment he looked up, eyes meeting mine across the street. There was no malice there, only dawning comprehension. He was beginning to understand, painfully, that anger and entitlement cannot bend the world to a person's will. I remained where I was, quiet, steady. My presence alone was enough, like a calm river cutting through chaos. The universe had done its part. I had done my part with patience. And now he had no one to blame but himself. By late afternoon, his attempts slowed, exhaustion setting in. My son, who had shouted, "Pack your bags and never come back," after the funeral, now understood for the first time that words carry weight, that actions carry consequences, and that life has a way of balancing itself when pride blinds judgment. I stayed back, observing him, letting the lessons settle in. I did not speak. I did not need to. Every heartbeat, every tremor, every faltering breath taught him more than my words ever could. And as the sun began to dip, casting long golden shadows across the street, I knew that transformation had begun. This was the moment where arrogance met consequence, where a son who thought he had power over me began to see the quiet, patient strength of a man who had endured grief, loved deeply, and lived rightly. And soon, he would understand fully that his world had shifted irrevocably, and there would be no turning back. The sun had sunk lower, spilling golden light across the quiet street, and my son was still sitting on the porch steps. His shoulders sagged, his chest rose and fell unevenly, and the sharpness in his eyes had dulled. The arrogance that had carried him after my wife's funeral was gone, replaced by exhaustion, shame, and the creeping weight of realization. I approached slowly, my footsteps measured on the pavement, hair catching the fading sunlight, clean-shaven face calm yet piercing. I didn't need to hurry. Justice was patient, and the lesson had already begun to take root. He glanced up as I neared, eyes wide, searching, hoping perhaps for some miracle that would erase the morning's truths. But the miracle he sought was not coming. You can't do this," he whispered, voice trembling. "This is my house, my life." I didn't respond immediately. I paused a few feet away, letting him feel the stillness, the quiet authority of a man who had endured grief, who had loved and lost, who had carried decades of life in a calm, measured way. The law had given me the house. The universe had given him humility. And he was beginning to understand that words, no matter how loud, cannot create power where respect and patience are absent. He tried to stand but faltered, his legs weak from panic and exhaustion. The weight of the morning pressed on him like a physical force. I noticed the trembling of his hands, the hollow look in his eyes, the way his chest heaved as if the air itself was heavier for him now. Every arrogant shout, every insult hurled after my wife's funeral, had led him here, and he could no longer hide from it. I could have taken him in anger. I could have yelled back, chastised him, thrown his own words at him like daggers. But that wasn't the way. I had learned long ago that calm is far more devastating than fury. I remained composed, my hair perfectly styled despite the long, exhausting day. My face clean-shaven and serene, my slightly healthy frame standing firm like a pillar of inevitability. He finally sank fully onto the concrete, head bowed, silent tears tracing lines down his face. And in that silence, I spoke not to hurt, but to guide. "Son," I said softly, my voice steady, warm, carrying the weight of decades. "Life has a way of showing us what we refuse to see in anger. You demanded I leave, threatened me after the only woman I ever loved passed away, and you thought power came from shouting and fear. But respect, love, and patience, those are what truly build a life." He looked up at me, confusion still etched across his features, but slowly, comprehension began to dawn. The arrogance that had once made him untouchable was now crumbling. He saw finally that his words had consequences, that he had misjudged the strength of a man who had endured more than he could imagine. I continued, calm and measured. "This house, this street, these memories, they are not yours to command with anger. They are ours, built with love, care, and time. And now you know. Actions have weight, words have consequences, and humility is something no wealth or power can buy." He trembled visibly, the realization almost too heavy to bear. His eyes, once full of rage, were now full of tears, guilt, and dawning understanding. I could feel the shift, the slow rebuilding of a young man who had been lost in pride, now beginning to grasp the truth. I sat down a few feet away, keeping the space between us, but radiating calm authority. He avoided my gaze at first, then slowly, hesitantly, he looked up. There was no need for insults, no need for shouting. The silence itself was enough, carrying the lesson deeper than any words could. Hours passed. The sky deepened to a rich purple, streetlights flickered on, and neighbors began to notice the quiet scene, a father and son separated by more than just distance, yet connected by the weight of a hard lesson. The boy who had shouted and demanded now sat humbled, stripped of the arrogance that had once blinded him. Finally, he spoke, voice small, almost a whisper. I'm sorry, Dad. I was wrong. I didn't understand." I nodded slowly, warm eyes meeting his. "I know, son. And that's why I didn't strike back in anger. I let the morning teach you what words and pride cannot hide. You will remember this day, not because I punished you, but because life, and sometimes silence, teaches more than fury ever could." He buried his face in his hands, sobbing quietly, the first tears of real understanding. I remained calm, letting him feel the weight of the lesson fully. He had demanded I leave, but in reality, he had been shown the only way to truly grow: humility, reflection, and respect.